Yes, it turns out that this is a good talk to end the workshop on, as it's more like after-dinner entertainment talk than a bunch of very careful, rigorous results that you have to stretch your brain around. I did what I sometimes do. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I told Wayne I would talk on a subject that I hadn't yet done the research on, and hoping that the research would be done. And it's not, but that's okay. So maybe I will inspire some folks to do it. I'm going to do it. So do it after I do it and then cite us. That's how you should do it. So the motivating idea, let's see if this works. Click on me, yeah. Okay, good. Here's the motivating idea. It goes back to, It goes back to, you're too young, but in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a whole set of debates about creationism and intelligent design in U.S. high schools and public schools, where we wanted to teach, some people wanted to teach high school students that natural selection and physicalist theories of laws of nature more generally could not possibly be good enough to explain the origin and nature of life on Earth. It didn't work. The Supreme Court said you can't do that. But there was a famous and kind of...
The room's currently muted. That's why.
That's why you always start with the amusing story, not with the substantive claims. Good. Anyway, the point was there's this bad argument that says life can't arise through the natural laws of physics because there's the second law of thermodynamics, which says that order decreases in the history of the universe. The universe becomes more disorderly, and yet living beings are exquisitely organized. So there's tension between the origin and existence of life and the second law. Now, we all know that that's a terrible argument because the biosphere and the Earth is not a closed system. I mean, there's literally, no one knows whether this was a joke or not, but there's a quote that says, you know, if life really could arise on Earth compatible with the second law, then there would have to be like some source of low-entropy energy in the sky. And there is, which is the sun. So here on Earth we get energy from the sun, but most importantly, the sun is a hot spot in a very cold sky. We are out of equilibrium. For every one photon of energy we get from the sun, the Earth radiates back the same amount of energy, but in 20 times the photons, so 20 times the entropy. So there's no in principle contradiction between the second law and the origin of life on Earth. But there is still an uncomfortable relationship, or at least some questions that arise. So there's no incompatibility with life arising on Earth, but did it have to? Is it easy? Like, why did it happen? If there is some general tendency of things to become less orderly over time, there's a question to be asked about the existence of things like people and workshops and stuff like that. Now, the simple answer to this one is that order versus disorder, or low entropy versus high entropy, is just a different idea than simple versus complex. And this is my favorite example here. This is cream mixing into coffee. It's really not cream mixing into coffee for experimental reasons. They mix too quickly. This is some vanilla liqueur and some chocolate liqueur that if you want to do the experiment at home. But you see on the left, you have a low entropy state. All the coffee's on the bottom, all the cream's on the top. On the right, we've mixed it together, and we have a high entropy state. But the low entropy state on the left is very simple. All the cream's on the top, all the coffee's on the bottom. The high entropy state on the right is very simple. They're all mixed together. Okay? It is the medium state, is the intermediate state in between when things look more complex, just to the naked eye. You see all these little swirls and tendrils. You would have to do more work to specify what exactly is the configuration of cream and coffee in that intermediate stage. That's when it looks complex. So we would like to sort of do science and philosophy to this, to understand better what's going on, and try to quantify what is going on. And this is a known thing. This is nothing new. So here's a graph you can find in the Scholarpedia article on complexity, which has entropy, or order, on the left, so low entropy, disorder on the right. I know some philosophers will correctly some physicists for that matter, be upset at the equating of low entropy with order, et cetera, but you know what they mean. And then you have complexity in the vertical axis. There's no labels or units or anything like that because we're just making things up and waving our hands at the moment. But roughly speaking, if you're very, very orderly, you're going to be simple. If you're very, very disorderly, you're going to be simple. And complexity can exist somewhere in between. As Jim Crutchfield says, this relationship is rediscovered every 5 years. Somehow it hasn't quite penetrated the common knowledge, but it is true. And the new thing that we're trying to do here is to put time and dynamics into the discussion. So if you think that low entropy is simple, high entropy is simple, and medium entropy can potentially be complex, and you also think that entropy increases over time, entropy starts low in the universe and grows higher, then potentially complexity in the universe starts low and increases over time, but then eventually decreases. So the overall path of complexity will be different than the overall path of entropy. Again, we would like to make this a bit more quantitative. So there's also plenty of work on the origin of complexity in dynamical physical systems, but they're all a little bit different and they kind of don't talk to each other. So part of the project here is to make all the different approaches to complexogenesis, the origin of complexity in the universe, compatible with each other, to fit them together, to see how they fit together. So a very famous one is in cellular automata. You can have a one-dimensional cellular automaton in the sense that one dimension plus time, so really 2 dimensions. You start with some bits, zeros and ones, and you apply a simple rule, so time goes downward, because these are computer scientists, not real scientists. And you show that even from a very simple initial state, you get much complexity going on, okay? And so Stephen Wolfram of others have advocated using these very simple systems as laboratories for understanding the origins of complexity. Not the problem with that, but an issue with that is it is fundamentally irreversible, right? This is not some limit of thermodynamics or anything like that. It's deterministic evolution, but completely irreversible from the past to the future. So in some sense, whatever complexity you might have at late times was inevitably built in at early times plus the rules. It's the rule doing all the work. It's not the specific configuration that you started with. And that seems to be different than what we have in the real universe. So a more physics-oriented thing is in this paper this is a review paper by Rupe and Crutchfield, maybe Roop and Crutchfield, I don't know. A wonderful paper. I encourage people to look at it if you're interested in these topics on principles of emergent organization. But they're very much sort of responding to the ideas from the 70s of Prigogine and others about dissipative systems and pattern formation and non-equilibrium physics, again, which is all great, but gets you as far as some like static configuration in an open system. A static configuration with a non-trivial pattern, which is very, very interesting, but very far from, a biological cell or something like that. And then finally, there's plenty of work done once you have biological cells and you have Darwinian evolution, then does complexity naturally increase over time? There's arguments that under the right circumstances it can. It's not inevitable. So there's a very nice book by Christoph Adami that just came out on the origin of complexity in biological information. But none of these things quite fit together, play nicely together, and so we're trying to get the big picture. We're trying to get the comprehensive theory based on fundamental physics and thermodynamics and statistical mechanics. What are the stages we go through as complexity increases over time? So the final bit of throat clearing here is that we don't know what complexity is, right? I'm going to preempt questions you will have. What do you mean by complexity? I'm a pluralist when it comes to what I mean by complexity. Like entropy, there are different definitions for the same word. They mean different things. It's no point in arguing over what is the right one. Different conceptions will play different roles under different circumstances. So there's computational complexity. If you're the P versus NP kind of person, you're thinking about the complexity of a question. Okay, you ask a question, what is the shortest distance path of the traveling salesman or something like that? And as a function of the input size, how many steps does it take your algorithm to solve that question? That's the computational complexity. The algorithmic or Kolmogorov complexity has to do with a string, a bit string or an image or something like that. So it's not even the complexity of the same kind of thing. Computational complexity is assigned to questions. Algorithmic complexity is assigned to strings or configurations. And it says, what is the shortest program that will output that string? So if your string is just a billion number ones, it's very easy. You don't need a billion string character program to print that out. You just have a loop that runs a billion times and print out ones. If you have a random number, the shortest program that prints it out is print, quote, the number. Okay, that's a much longer thing. So that's high Kolmogorov or algorithmic complexity. Charlie Bennett introduced something called logical depth, which is similar to Kolmogorov complexity, but it's the time it takes to run rather than the number of steps, rather than the size of the program. And in fact, in practice, if you go to the Santa Fe Institute or someplace like that, where they work in complex systems, they don't really care about any of these definitions. These definitions are wonderful because they're quantitative, but they're not what we really mean very often. Phenomenologically, we know complexity when we see it. When we have a system that has many little subsystems, and those subsystems interact in interesting and important hierarchical ways, we call that a complex system. Okay, throat clearing out of the way. So we're going to deal with this multiplicity of definitions of complexity by introducing a new one, specifically aimed to understanding the cream mixing into coffee better. And this is going to be what we call apparent complexity. This is work I did with Scott Aronson and Lauren Willett and a couple of others that I'll show you the results of later. So what is going on with the cream and the coffee? You didn't object, maybe you're just too polite, but when I said the left was simple, the right was simple, the middle was complex, what does that mean really? It's not quite algorithmic complexity. If you had the complete microstate of all those molecules, then that complexity is more or less constant. You need to sort of tell me where every molecule is. What we've done is what we very commonly do in thermodynamics. We coarse-grained, right? We looked at the configuration. We don't see the molecules. We see roughly what looks like cream and what looks like coffee. So what you can do is, in general, take some microscopic theory, coarse-grain it, that is to say, get a bunch of states in the micro theory and assign them to the same state in some macroscopic theory. David Wallace talked about this kind of thing in his talk. And then you can ask about the algorithmic or Kolmogorov complexity of the coarse-grained description. So in other words, what we call the apparent complexity says how long does your description have to be to completely specify the macro state of the system under some coarse graining. That's literally what was happening when I said on the left, cream is on the top, coffee is on the bottom. That's the shortest program that outputs the picture on the left. Everything's mixed together. That's the shortest program that puts everything on the right. In the middle, you would have to actually tell me where the specific swirls of the cream and coffee were. And so let's show how this happens in practice and why it sort of resolves the weirdness of Kolmogorov complexity. And again, we're not saying this is the right or the only definition of complexity. It's just the appropriate one for this puzzle that we're looking at. So Kolmogorov says, what's the shortest program that tells you the length of that specifies a system? And in this case, our system is just a string of numbers. So if something is just a string of ones, let's put it after the decimal point, doesn't really matter. That is low complexity. It's easy to write a program that prints that out. Most of us can do that. If you have a random number, as we said at the very bottom, that is high Kolmogorov complexity. The only thing you can do is print the number. But maybe there is some structure there, but incomplete structure. So if you have a number that has chunks of it which don't vary that much. So in the first 10 digits, it's only zeros or ones. In the second 10 digits, it's only sevens or eights. You could, this is not a very good example because you should get a much bigger number to really see the effect, but you can imagine a sort of intermediate scale program that could print that out that would be shorter than just printing the whole number, but longer than just a loop that prints out ones. So here, the Kolmogorov complexity goes up as you go from complete repetition to sort of partial repetition in order to complete disorder. The apparent complexity is sort of nicer for our purposes. It says, let's coarse grain. So in this case, what I mean by coarse graining is take chunks of 10 digits in this particular problem and just take their average and round down or whatever, or round to the nearest integer, and I'm going to replace my 10-digit string with 1 digit, okay, given by that average. So if all the numbers are just ones, that coarse graining just gives me another list of ones. I have not changed the fact that it's low complexity. It's low Kolmogorov complexity. It's low apparent complexity. If I have medium, the medium Kolmogorov complexity, then when I do this coarse graining, so I take strings of 10 digits at a time and I average them, I'm going to get different numbers. I'll get, just what looks like now a random series of numbers. So the Kolmogorov complexity of that will be kind of medium high, lower than it was for the entire string, but still it's going to require some length of the program to tell me what's going on. But when I had a high Kolmogorov complexity string, entirely random, that randomness goes away under the coarse graining. I mean, it looks a little random here. It says 4, 5, 4, but it would be nothing but 4s and 5s for almost all of the case. And I could, if I extended this to 1 billion digits at a time, it would be much more clear. I had smoothed out all of the randomness. And so this is now low apparent complexity. So you see what is going on in that definition. Now we'd like to apply it to this question of the evolution of complexity over time. So with our definition of apparent complexity, the relationship to entropy that I already showed you, that it goes up and then down, is perfectly obvious. So here is entropy, by which I now mean the formula that is on Boltzmann's tombstone, S equals K log W. I have some space of microstates. I have some macrostates, some coarse graining of unequal sized macrostates, and the entropy is the logarithm of the volume of the macrostate. And then I can ask about the apparent complexity. Well, if I'm in a low entropy state, it doesn't require a very long program to tell you what macrostate I'm in. I'm in the low entropy macrostate. There aren't that many of them, right? All the molecules are in the corner of the room or whatever it might be. But you certainly don't have to tell me what every molecule is doing. Likewise, when I'm very high entropy, I can just tell you I'm in equilibrium. I'm in the high entropy state. There aren't that many high entropy states. The possibility of apparent complexity arises when you're medium entropy, when you have room for complex things to go on, but you haven't yet just smoothed out all the way to equilibrium. So the idea that the complexity can go up and down matches our intuition for how Boltzmann entropy works. So what that suggests is we have the possibility of apparent complexity evolving from simplicity to simplicity over time. But there's a maximum. What you can derive is how much complexity can you fit into a macrostate of a certain entropy. It's low at the endpoints and high in between. But there's a physics question that now comes up. Does it actually happen? Do you approach this envelope? And the answer is it's going to depend on your dynamics. So you can imagine dynamics for different kinds of systems where you will start simple, become complex, and then the complexity will go away. You can also imagine dynamics where you just stay simple the whole time. And now we have an empirical question. Now it's an interesting question for philosophers of physics and for physicists. What kinds of laws of physics allow or lead to the creation of complexity along the way? There's no analog of the second law of thermodynamics for complexity that says complexity has to arise along the way. It's going to depend on details. So let's look at some cases. So here is a cup of coffee made into a little two-dimensional cellular automaton. So we have cream molecules and coffee molecules. And we invent some dynamics for the cream and the coffee to mix into each other. And then we're going to coarse grain, and we're going to calculate the apparent complexity of the resulting image. So there is something I didn't tell you. The apparent complexity is the Kolmogorov complexity of the coarse-grained image. Kolmogorov complexity is uncomputable in principle. A real computer scientist would tell you this. You can't, even in principle, calculate the Kolmogorov complexity. Why not? You would think it's the length of the shortest program that outputs the string. Why can't I just go through every possible program from the shortest ones getting longer and longer until I output the string, because of the halting problem, because you will write down a program and you don't know whether it will eventually print out your string or whether it goes forever. So technically speaking, you can't calculate the Kolmogorov complexity. But in practice, you can certainly estimate it very well. It's a weird thing where there's an uncalculable thing that you can estimate very well. You just need a compression algorithm. And you can prove that this compression algorithm is, as we were talking about before, probably approximately correct. It probably does a good job of maximally compressing the data. So we used gzip. That's a famous compression algorithm. There's other ones. This is telling you how you can compress the coarse-grained image in a very practical sense. And by the way, I'm not like being a physicist or philosopher here. You could actually do this. You can take that image of the cream in the coffee, and you can crop out everything but the specific example, and you can save it as a JPEG. And the JPEG file for the glass in the middle will be bigger than the file for the left and the right, because it is harder to compress that image. Okay, so whoever invented JPEG knew about apparent complexity in their bones. And now, once we invent some algorithm, we can ask, okay, does complexity grow? So this is truth in advertising. We wrote the paper. We had two different models of mixing cream and coffee. We said that one developed complexity, one didn't. We made a mistake. And so we learned something by our mistakes. So here was the first version of the paper. We had two different models, one in which the molecules literally don't even know about each other. So we had an idea that there was something called a coffee molecule and it just randomly moves through the space. In the other one, there were interactions, but they were nearest neighbor interactions. So there's a probability per unit time that two local cells that are nearest neighbors will flip their identities with each other. In both cases, you see on the top pictures are the fine-grained images. The bottom pictures are the coarse-grained images. And coarse graining literally just means take a 10 by 10 grid or something like that and take the average. Okay? The cream mixes into the coffee both ways, with what we call the diffusive model and the locally interacting model. And so in one of them, in the diffusive model, there's no interactions between the particles. In the local model, there is. It matters what your other particles are. But after we fixed the paper, neither one of them develops any complexity, as it turns out. In fact, provably so. You can have theorems that say they can't do it. So, oh my goodness, what do? You fix the paper. Sadly, I like to say this in public to humiliate myself and motivate myself into getting it done. We still haven't submitted the revised version of the paper years later, but we're going to do it. We have the revised version. So here's a new model of the dynamics. Randomly select a direction, either vertical or horizontal. Randomly select a segment of the torus on which the cream and coffee are defined. This is not that physical. I still am a physicist at heart. And shift in some random number of steps, up or down, left or right. Okay, we call this the tectonic model. The clear difference between this model and the other models we looked at is many things move coherently at once in this model. And what you see now, this is the fine-grained picture, and you see these beautiful swirls, this fractal kind of pattern. This is what you want to see. This is complexity developing. And indeed, you coarse grain, calculate the apparent complexity using gzip, and you get the blue curve. So we plotted here the tectonic model and the diffusive model, the one where you have these coherent shifts up, down, left, right. Complex structure does arise in the sense of apparent complexity. In the diffusive model, where there's no interaction between the different cells, it does not. It just remains flat. So validating our intuition that whether or not complexity grows is going to depend on the details of the dynamics that you have. So you can prove some theorems about this. I can't, but my collaborators can. So the diffusive model and the local model cannot develop apparent complexity. These are always, up to approximations, but there's a limit in which it becomes true. And you can prove the tectonic model does develop apparent complexity, even get the exponent right on the time steps. So what did we learn? I'm not sure, but to complete our little grid, there are interactions in the tectonic model, and there is complexity. Unlike the other two, why? So what is the lesson that we learned? I don't know yet, but the obvious difference is that the tectonic model is multi-scale. It allows for coherent motions of many pixels in the same direction at the same time, whereas the other ones were just local. So one tentative lesson is that if you want to develop complexity, if you want to have some laws of physics that allow complexity to develop in this sense, you need some sort of multi-scale dynamic, some long-range forces. The universe has long-range forces, as Patricia reminded us, so maybe this is an important step in the right direction. So I would now like to shift to that question of the real world. So, this model that we had of coffee and cream mixing together, it's nice because you can do it. Even I can write the program to do this, right? I mean, I have AI helpers, but I can do it. But it's not the real world. It's not thermodynamics, really, right? It's not deterministic laws of physics. There's random numbers put in there. So we would like to do the same kind of thing in the real world. We know that the real world seems to have similar behavior. Here is cosmology. So these are images of the universe, 1 second after the Big Bang, several 100,000 years after the Big Bang, 14 billion years after the Big Bang, a quadrillion years after the Big Bang, and a Google years after the Big Bang. At early times, the universe is super dense, super hot, but also very, very smooth, featureless, low apparent complexity. It was a very simple early state for the universe. As it expands and cools, structure grows. Today, which is the middle picture, we have all these stars and galaxies in very specific locations of the universe. The green and yellow picture there is the cosmic microwave background. So you see small fluctuations, but they grow under the influence of gravity to what we see today, highly complex in the sense of apparent complexity. But that will go away. The universe continues to expand. Things fall into black holes. 10 to the 15 years is chosen because that's the last gasp of the last star, as far as we know. The last star that shines, according to burning nuclear fuel, will last about 10 to the 15 years, and then the universe becomes dark and cold. All of the stars and planets will eventually fall into black holes. Those black holes will eventually evaporate. 10 to the 100 years is chosen because that's how long it will take the supermassive black holes at the centers of galaxies to completely Hawking evaporate away. We think that the universe is accelerating because of a vacuum energy. We know the universe is accelerating. The most popular explanation for that is the cosmological constant, or vacuum energy, and that is supposed to not go away. We don't know because it's the future, and the future is hard to predict. But under that assumption, the universe will become cold and dilute and empty 10 to the 100 years from now and stay that way forever. Now, there's a little bit of an issue with calculating the entropy of these different moments in time. At early times, everything is very smooth, and you can literally use the ideal gas law. The entropy of our observable universe is something like 10 to the 88th. Okay? It grows mostly in the intermediate scales because of black holes. The black hole at the center of our galaxy today has an entropy of order 10 to the 90th. In other words, that single black hole has more entropy than all of the particles in the smooth universe at early times. At late times, what we think we should do is assign an entropy to the cosmological horizon associated with the vacuum energy. That's a much bigger entropy. And so you see low entropy going to high entropy in accord with the second law of thermodynamics. That's good. You're not surprised by that. You also see simplicity becoming complex and then going back to simplicity again. So just like the cup of coffee, the universe exhibits this ephemeral growth and then decay of complexity. Why did it do that? How delicately does that depend on the specific laws of physics that we have? Is it possible to quantify the stages through which you go? Is it possible to relate the stages? Do they sort of build on each other, or are they independent? That is what we are trying to figure out. This is work I'm working on right now with Gulce Cardes, who is a graduate student. And from this point on, there's nothing but hand-waving in the rest of the talk. So this is an invitation to think about these issues. We don't know the answers yet. We have some ideas. So I will give you two actual true statements in the form of asides. For those of you who are not cosmology buffs, two cosmological facts. One is there is a very close connection between the evolution of the universe and the equilibration of a box of gas in thermodynamics. There is something called the cosmic no-hair theorem that goes back to the 1980s. Bob Wald proved that if you have a universe expanding with a positive cosmological constant, as long as it doesn't recollapse, the cosmological constant eventually wins. This is the cosmic no-hair theorem. All the lumps and peculiarities of the universe dilute away, all the perturbations, all the black holes, etc., and you asymptote to an empty universe with nothing but a positive cosmological constant called de Sitter space. This always reminded me of the second law of thermodynamics and the approach to thermal equilibrium, right? This inevitability of this sort of bland future state. So finally, Aidan Chatwin Davis and I were able to prove a theorem under some very restrictive assumptions. So I invite all of you to think harder about how to generalize this theorem. But a cosmic equilibration theorem. So can you relate cosmic no-hair to the increase of entropy over time? First, you need a definition of entropy. So there is a good definition of entropy relevant to our purposes that was put forward by Busso and Engelhardt. So there is this idea of the generalized entropy in quantum gravity that includes the areas of event horizons, the Hawking formula for that, plus the entropy of matter. So Busso and Engelhardt were able to generalize this to situations where you have more complicated things than just black holes plus matter. They include the cosmological entropy as well. And what we were able to prove is if this Busso and Engelhardt version of the generalized entropy increases over time, but not forever, it increases to a maximum value and then asymptotes there, then the future space-time that you're defining this entropy on approaches de Sitter space. And we prove this without using Einstein's equation. So Wald's theorem is a theorem of general relativity. He uses Einstein's equation to show this is what happens. We purely use thermodynamics to prove the same thing. But of course, we have a formula for the entropy that involves the area of event horizon. So you can argue that comes out of general relativity. But of course, you could also argue that general relativity comes out of that. This is the question of whether or not you should think of GR as an equation of state, a la Ted Jacobson et al. So this is kind of a thermodynamic gravity kind of result. But the point is you can think of the expansion and cooling of the universe as an approach to thermal equilibrium. The second aside I will give you is that quantum mechanics appears in this talk only on this slide, but it's kind of the whole generating mechanism here. If you think about inflationary cosmology, which may or may not be right, but if it is, then the quantum state of the universe during inflation is extremely simple, right? It's basically the Bunch-Davis vacuum. It's not exactly right, but very, very close to that. So there, it has told you the actual full quantum state. Once you're at the cosmic microwave background, this is data from the Planck satellite, there's clearly a lot of specificity there. There are perturbations, slightly more dense regions, slightly less dense regions. Where did all that specificity and complexity come from? Well, it came from quantum mechanics. It came from, if you understand quantum mechanics well, decoherence and branching of the wave function. So basically, a simple overall state is equivalent to the sum of many complex individual states. So there's not an incompatibility with the idea that the overall state of the universe is actually very simple. The specific branch in which we find ourselves can nevertheless look complex. I should stop for questions. Are there any questions now? The hand waving is only going to go faster. So, all right. So here is our idea. The idea is to figure out how we can think about the origin of complex structures as a set of stages, of phase transitions that you go through. Not the whole universe at once, but the appearance of subsystems of the universe that kind of are complex in more and more sophisticated ways. The coffee and cream example and apparent complexity are literally the dumbest version of complexity. It's literally how complicated does the image look like when you look at it. But we know that, if you go to Santa Fe or talk to real complexity theorists, they're going to use words like function and organization and things like that. How do they fit in to this program? So the idea is you can start with apparent complexity. That's like the first thing that appears. It's literally just how much work you have to do to specify the macroscopic configuration. And then, and this is all very tentative, but there's something that happens, which I will argue is sort of in this spirit an example of complexity, which you might call metastable complexity, where you use the fact that the entropy of your system is very low and you're out of equilibrium to make a temporarily metastable configuration. This is very well understood in nonlinear dynamics, non-equilibrium steady states. There's even a known acronym, NESS, right, where you have something that is not mechanically stable, like a chair or a planet, but is temporarily stable just because it can use fuel from the environment or from itself to maintain its stability. Then you get to a stage where you have some kind of what we call modular complexity. This is where you actually have your big system made of parts, and the parts are sort of constrained in how they fit together and interact. So in some very simple sense, a box of gas with Avogadro's number of particles in it has a lot of parts, but they have the atoms, but the atoms just do their own thing. They bump into each other. They don't sort of collaborate to make anything specifically complex. So the modular complexity is when you really have functional subsystems that play some role. Arguably something like the climate would be an example, without yet invoking biology, of a complex system with many little parts interacting. Then, of course, inevitably, life and biology are going to come in. So there's something that we call responsive complexity, where your system somehow encodes information about the outside world. So this would be measurable in terms of mutual information between the state of your system and the state of the outside world. As systems take advantage of this complexity, they are able to survive and persevere and even flourish by knowing something about the world around them. And then maybe they even get to a stage where they can predict the future of the world. So that would be mutual information between states at different times, predictive complexity. And the program is to sort of fit all these together and trace out the steps that you go on along the way and fit it all into ways that fundamental physics makes sense. And stochastic thermodynamics, which Billy talked about a little bit, it seems to be the right context in which to ask these questions. So my personal belief, which I've not yet made very quantitative and rigorous, is that we can make progress by thinking of information as a resource. You know, we've been told again and again, thermodynamics is a resource theory. Here's the sort of resource that the universe gives us, being low entropy at early times. You can plug numbers in. For our observable universe, the co-moving volume of the universe that we see today had an entropy at early times about 10 to the 88th. Its maximum is about 10 to the 122. The miracle of notation makes those numbers not look very different. They're very different, these numbers, especially when you remember the entropy is a logarithm of something. These numbers are super, super different. So compared to the maximum entropy, the early entropy of the universe is very, very low. It has a long way to increase. That's why it's 14 billion years later and we're still not anywhere near thermal equilibrium. And in a very real sense, that's a resource, which is the available information. The decrement, the difference between the maximum entropy and the entropy, is something that we can take advantage of to sort of create complexity and interestingness and survive along the way in different ways. So just to illustrate what we have in mind here, the difference between what we've called apparent complexity and we studied in the coffee and cream system versus non-equilibrium steady states, which kind of take advantage of that low entropy in a more detailed central way. So on the left, we have an actual simulation of large-scale structure. And this is, I think, purely a dark matter-only simulation. I will click the button and it will evolve over time. And what you see is structure forming, small differences in density from place to place grow. Gravity tends to turn up the contrast knob on the universe. And as Patricia's very nice talk just before mine reminded us, there's not really an equilibrium that you reach in these systems, okay? You get more and more complexity, but you don't stop evolving. You slow down, and it is super interesting that there are scales and conditions under which, for all intents and purposes, subsystems look like they're in equilibrium, but really they're not. As you form a galaxy, that galaxy never stops growing, or never stops evolving. In fact, it keeps shrinking as you spit off high energy particles. The rest of the thing can change, can shrink, and there's the gravithermal catastrophe. You never stop evolving. Whereas for a star, stars are not technically in equilibrium either, but they're much closer. These are all matters of details and timescales and things like that. A star settles down and it starts burning its fuel. That's only possible because the fuel is very, very low entropy. If you made a star out of iron, it would not burn any fuel, okay? But it has this resource to use. It's not really information in any sense that we would recognize it, but mathematically it's sort of the same thing. And because of that, you can have this configuration that is not mechanically stable, but is in local thermodynamic equilibrium, and it will last billions of years. And so that's a sort of new kind of stability, a new kind of complexity, I would argue, even though a real complexity theorist would not quite recognize it. And then moving up the chain, we get to modular complexity, and now we would recognize it if you were a real complexity theorist. Once you have a big system made of small systems, a world opens up to you. So this really is a phase transition in a very real sense. And again, we're looking for the right way to get order parameters to describe these phase transitions, etc. But this is where a huge space of possibilities becomes available. By taking a system and thinking of it as a set of small things that can be combined in different ways. And that very simple paradigm works from atoms and molecules up through, this is a protein interaction network, neurons in your brain, organs in your body, computers on the internet. The same kind of paradigm happens over and over again. I don't have that much to say about this that is profound other than one simple fact, which is that once you enter this regime, once you are constructing systems out of small parts that can be fit together in different ways, the space of relevant possibilities becomes very, very big indeed. Again, box of gas has many different possibilities, but who cares? There's no functional difference between them. Once you have little parts that can take different values and fit together in different ways, combinatorics gives you a very, very large space of possibilities. So here's how I like to think about it. Imagine, you know that DNA is a series of base pairs. The base pairs take on 4 different values, okay? So if you have n base pairs, the number of possible states you could get is 4 to the n. Just to drive home how big that number is, let's ask, could we explore the space of genomes effectively? So if we have a set of genomes, a set of base pairs, n base pairs in a strand of DNA, how well could we do testing out all the possible values of those genomes for their fitness, right? If you made an organism this way, most of them would just be junk, but you're looking for the good ones. Apparently, evolution has managed to find some good ones. Here we are, right? So how hard can it be to explore the space of states? Well, take every baryon in the universe, put it in the form of a base pair, a nucleotide for DNA, make them all into, this is not a realistic experiment, but take 10 to the 80th baryons, make them all in the DNA, make them all in strands of length n, and imagine that each strand keeps changing its values, so it changes which amino acid is doing its work, and it goes through all the 4 to the n different possibilities as fast as it can. Every strand searches 1 billion different possibilities per second. The whole universe is doing this. And it does this for the whole lifetime of the universe, 10 to the 17 seconds. All right? We're maxing out our ability to search the space of configurations. And the question for you is, the question for you is, how big could n be before the space of possibilities becomes so large that we cannot sample it in the age of the universe? You're not going to get the right answer, but I want you to think about the order of magnitude here in your head, okay? We put every baryon in the universe to work searching through different possible genomes 1 billion times a second. How long can our DNA be before it's so long that we can't search the space of possibilities? Anyone want to suggest an answer? Sorry? Yeah, that's right. 181 base pairs is how well we can do it. Someone can take logarithms very quickly. Good. It's not really that hard. But the impact of this is that the human genome is 3 billion base pairs. Okay? So the point is, there's no possible sense in which we are exploring the space of possibilities effectively. It's not ergodic, right? The timescales matter here. So the lesson for complexogenesis researchers is, in what way does the real world search the space of genomes somewhat effectively, right? Clearly, we're not sampling the space very carefully or very assiduously, but nevertheless, we find functional things. How does that happen? I don't know the answer, but I will say one very, very trivial but important thing, which is that photons matter. Nobody is surprised by this, that photons matter for your life. But here's the point. Imagine that you didn't have any photons. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this is because in something like the cellular automata, either that Wolfram looks at or that we looked at in the coffee automaton, there's no dissipation, right? There's no loss of energy into an environment or anything like that. But in the real world, there obviously is. And that opens up a huge amount of extra space that you can look at. So here is phase space for some system, and we're going to imagine that you can sensibly factorize phase space into the phase space of some matter particles, some atoms or whatever, and the phase space of the environment, some photons and so forth. And the point is, if you didn't have the environment, and you didn't have the ability to lose energy effectively into the environment, you would be stuck on a constant energy hypersurface. Energy is conserved. So you could go back and forth and look for interesting complex structures in that space. But once you can radiate photons into the universe, now you can go up and down, as well as right and left. And it seems plausible to me, and we have some tentative indications, but we're still working on this, that the islands of metastability that we're interested in for complexity purposes are small in phase space, and you have to have a way to get there. And the way to get there is, of course, to dissipate energy by giving off photons. And when I say the word photon, the important thing about photons is they're massless particles. So you can give off energy in as small of an increment as you like. If you were really doing discrete physics on some cellular automaton, even if you had a way to give off energy, there'd be a discrete lump of it, which would prevent you from doing arbitrarily close approaches to these interesting islands of metastability. So part of what we're working on is making this sketchy figure a little bit more rigorous, a little bit more careful. So eventually we make life. People have noticed this, that life exists, that the origin of life is a tricky thing that we don't completely understand. I doubt that we, using stochastic thermodynamics, will correctly explain the origin of life. Apparently things like molybdenum are important. So it seems unlikely that general philosophical principles will get us there. But we might be able to understand how the use of information in life plays a role in what we now call the origin of life. Just as background, for those of you who don't think about this that much, in standard treatments of the origin of life, we are told that three things matter. Compartmentalization, that is to say you have something like a cell wall, so the interior is your new organism, the exterior is everything else. Replication, so life is a chemical reaction that is self-sustaining, but it's not like fire or a crystal growing where it's just sort of mindlessly repeating a pattern. There's information about the specific structure. In the real world, it's contained in RNA and DNA, and that is passed down through the generations. So that's what we mean by replication. And finally, metabolism, right? The whole idea of life, it is not mechanically stable. A chair is not alive. If you do your Zen practice, and you sit down and you meditate and you try to still your breathing and your thoughts, etc., there's still a buttload of ATPs being generated inside you. There's a lot of stuff going on inside your body, generating entropy, relying on fuel from the outside world that helps you be stable. And so that's an important role. That's the metabolism example here. It turns out, experimentally in your chemistry laboratory, it's remarkably easy to do proto-compartmentalization. It's not that hard to throw a bunch of chemicals together and have these fatty bilipids make little spherical globules that would act like primitive versions of cell walls. The other two aspects, replication and metabolism, are hard in various ways. We have not yet in the lab, as far as my knowledge is updated, been able to come up with a single molecule or a single chemical molecule-like system that will accurately replicate itself all by itself, passing down complex information from step to step. We have sets of two molecules, A and B, that will make each other. So that sounds good. I don't know, life could be based on something like that, but we're not able to do something like RNA just ab initio in the lab. And there's therefore a debate in the origin of life literature, which came first, metabolism or replication. There's replication first people. They're in the majority. They say that the early conditions under which life formed was an RNA world. If you know a little bit about the biology here, in modern cells you have the DNA containing the information, gives it to RNA, which tells a ribosome how to use that information to make a protein. Okay, so it's DNA to RNA to proteins. So the proteins are the functional part, the DNA are the storage part, but RNA is kind of both. RNA has an ability to store information, but it's more fragile than DNA. It has ability to function, but it's less flexible than proteins. So the idea is that if RNA is the one thing that could do both, it probably is what came first. RNA could be there at the beginning of life, and then we would eventually learn how to more accurately and reliably store that genetic information in DNA. But the metabolism first people, like to talk about entropy a lot. It's very physics friendly, the metabolism first kind of way of thinking here. So here's one of my favorite quotes from origin of life researcher Michael Russell. "The purpose of life is to hydrogenate carbon dioxide." What does that mean? So his theory is, here is a plot of free energy, so it's upside down with respect to entropy, of various ways to take a carbon atom and decorate it with oxygen and hydrogen, okay? So if you start with CO2, carbon dioxide, that has more free energy in it, that is, say, is lower entropy than methane, CH4. So if all you knew was that the universe liked to increase the entropy of the universe, you would say, the carbon dioxide, like in water where there's a lot of hydrogen lying around, that carbon dioxide will turn into methane, CH4, will hydrogenate. But it turns out that there's the equivalent of a potential barrier in between, okay? So there's various things you can do step by step to that CO2, which require decreases in the free energy, at least in some simple versions of chemistry. This involves chemistry. This is not my thing. I'm just reporting things that I've read. Not ask me any questions. But so Russell and his collaborators said, look, there's a lot of resource there. In the sense of low entropy being a resource, if you have conditions in the early Earth with an excess of CO2, there's something that can be done, converting it to methane. But it's not going to happen by itself. You need the right set of catalysts and enzymes. You need a complex chemical reaction network to release all of that entropy. And their idea is that that happens under certain conditions, and that complex chemical reaction network grows into the proto-metabolic system for early life. And only later did they learn how to sort of replicate that information using RNA and things like that. So for what it's worth, on the basis of this thought, Michael Russell predicted a couple decades ago that there should be warm alkaline smokers on the ocean floor, certain geological formations with these kinds of conditions necessary to start and catalyze these complex chemical reactions. And after he predicted it, they found them. Alvin, the little submersible that went around the Atlantic Ocean floor and made pictures. This is the Lost City Formation, which is a specific kind of hydrothermal vent that they didn't know that existed before, and they found it on the basis of this theory of the origin of life. Now, they found it because they were down there looking for interesting things, but it was predicted on the basis of this theory for the origin of life. And the reason why it's physics friendly is because the motto here is that even though life is itself kind of organized and complex, it exists not despite the fact that entropy is increasing, but because entropy is increasing. Here's an example where entropy can increase, but only via the medium of complex structures doing the work. And then finally, once you have life, you can think in this information-theoretic, information-centric paradigm about the different ways in which living organisms use information, right? You can imagine calculating the mutual information. Christoph Adami would tell you that there is a lot of mutual information between the genome of an organism and its environment, in the very simple sense that that genome makes organisms adapted to that environment, right? It matters. If you change the environment, that genome will no longer succeed in a Darwinian sense. But there's also individual organisms, and they know something. Like we have a map of the world in our heads. We have some knowledge of the world around us. So that's a true fact even in very primitive organisms. Bacteria do what is called chemotaxis. If you put them in a petri dish with a gradient of nutrients, of glucose, so there's more glucose on one side than the other, the bacteria will move toward the directions of higher concentrations of nutrients. The question is, and this, I promise you this is an honest question, I didn't know the answer. I was thinking about this complexogenesis information stuff, and I said it would be really cool if the bacterium moving through the gradient was not just like a ball rolling down a hill, right? Balls roll down hills, but they don't have mutual information with the hill. They're just responding to the immediate forces being pushed on them. For the bacterium, it seemed to be an open question to me, because I don't know anything about biology. Is the bacterium just locally responding to the gradient? Or are there bits of information inside the bacterium that represent where the gradient is changing? And it turns out the latter is true. There are these two-component regulatory systems that keep track of where the nutrients are in the dish. So in some very real sense, even this very, very simple organism has some knowledge, if you want to call it that, of what is going on in the world around it. Again, this is the kind of thing, this is potentially an order parameter between the organism and the rest of the world that represents a kind of complexity that it can take use of. And that's it. I had these questions. There's plenty of questions. That should be pretty obvious. But I do think that, this whole study of the origin of complexity is on the one hand hard because it's pre-paradigmatic. Like I said, we don't have the one true definition of complexity. We don't have a list of things that happen, a set of equations we can rely on, but we're inventing those equations, and I think they're very inventable. I think that's where science is at its most exciting, and the role of philosophy here, I hope, is completely obvious and evident. So I foresee great fun things happening in the years to come. Thank you.
It was unlikely philosophy to be able to arrive at reasons that molybdenum, for example, should be involved. I just wanted to point out that molybdenum has atomic number 42, and I could go amongst all towards explaining its role.
That could be. Let's write that up. I think that's a paper, yeah.
Other questions? People online? And let me ask something. This is just like you're going to two. Okay, an online question first. I'll come back to myself. Satri Dalani.
Thanks, David. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No problem.
Sean, so this is really, really fun, and I hope I can join in the conversation on information and complexity. I have a pretty basic conceptual question to start with, though. As you were going through the stages of the universe, following the tectonic model, you made this claim in passing that I would really appreciate a little more development on, which is the connection between multi-scaling and long-range forces. It wasn't immediately obvious to me how changing, the individual pixels was related to long-range forcing. Maybe if you imagine that you can stretch a pixel so far and wide that it encapsulates what we would call a long-range interaction within a single that was offhand a thought that I had, but yeah, I would love you to say more about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure how satisfying my answer will be, but I'll give it a shot. I mean, obviously, we are spoiled or biased or informed by the real world, right? And what we know is that in the real world, long-range forces play a hugely important role in certainly the cosmological evolution of the universe. If a very massive object comes by our galaxy, like if another galaxy comes by, it coherently pushes around the whole galaxy, but not exactly equally. It pushes around the parts that are nearby more than the parts that are far away. So the idea is, and I would love to be able to make this more careful and rigorous, but the idea is that there's an interplay between those coherent long-range forces and the short-range forces of atoms or protons bumping into each other and dissipating and giving off photons and making molecules and absorbing light and all that stuff that contributes to complexogenesis. In the coffee automaton, we can't realistically model gravity in any way, but the idea was that the tectonic model, which by hand put in coherent motions, so some fraction of the entire lattice is pushed up 1 pixel, vertically or horizontally or whatever at a time, that's the best we can do to sort of model the existence of gravity or other long-range forces. And indeed, it did what we wanted. It led to complexity. So there's really nothing more to it than that. I'm not sure if that is satisfying or not, but it's basically a hint that there is indeed a role being played by these coherent long-range forces. Did that answer the question or no?
It begins to. I think I would need to
Good.
understand a little more how the tectonic shifting produces those coherent motions, such
Right.
as an analogy to use Patricia's talk for long-range forces.
Yep.
So I've got myself in the line here. Can I ask just a couple of more things about the coffee example? The first is just explanatory. I mean, so you said it didn't work for the 2 initial models, but I mean, just eyeballing those pictures you gave, it certainly looked like the ones on the left would be describable in a couple of bits, and the ones on the right would be describable in a couple of bits, and the ones in the middle look like they take a lot of bits to describe. So what's going on?
Can I do this?
Yes, please.
Okay. Is this going to work? No. I'm going to use this. Okay.
It should work. You can use it that way.
Okay. Nope. No, I can't. There we go. Okay. I know what pictures David is referring to here.
Yeah.
These pictures.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just quantitatively very small. Like those, it might be, you notice that the time scales are very different on these. We don't, because of the dynamics are being very different. And I can't tell you what the choice of contrast for the images is. So it might look more complex than it really is. But you notice that in both cases, it's kind of like, it's on a torus, so it's not very even, but the black stuff is still on the bottom, the gray stuff is in the middle, the white stuff is on the top, in a way that once you get the tectonic model in there, it's really swirling around. So ultimately, it's a quantitative question, but I do think it's compatible. Yeah.
So the second one was just a thought about why this is potentially happening in these models. And the thought is somewhat in play, but it's something like this. I mean, the way this works is you've got a fixed grain of coarse graining, and then we see the complexity with regard to that grain. There's a different thing we might imagine saying, which is like, what's the grain of coarse graining we need to essentially completely describe the system? And that, of course, is just going to go monotonically up as you go through the system. Like at the beginning, I can just coarse grain into 2 cells and it's fine, and then by the time the system's equilibrated, I'm going to need the complete bitmap. And if I work out the sort of fine grain cosmological complexity in that sense, you kind of expect it just to go up and up. And so if you then stop at a fixed grain, which is being imposed by some presumably outside constraint as to what the light framework is, then it feels fairly natural. You'd expect the complexity to keep going up until the fixed grain coincides with whatever the grain is you actually have to describe it, and then to go back down again as you start thermalizing inside each coarse grain cell. Is that describing the model about right? I mean, I'm just trying to understand the shape of it.
I'm not sure.
Yeah. Fair answer.
I'm not sure because it really is, in this model where you see the complexity in our sense, it really does look fractal, right? I mean, once it's getting there, we could have gone on and it gets more and more mushy, but there really is, I would not take that last image and say there's a scale, right? So I think that we're playing fair, but we're very, very open to better ways of defining apparent complexity for a system like this. But we chose our way ahead of time and then did the experiment, which is, philosophers will tell me, the respectable thing to do.
Any other questions? Yeah, okay, 7 questions, great. Let's go across the room this way.
When you were introducing the 3 necessary functions of life, and then you provided the information-centric interpretations, the compartmentalization in your list there is replaced by adaptation.
Right.
And so I may have missed one sentence, but if you could, I mean, obviously, I wonder if you could say something about that.
I can, but only if you give me the microphone. I can't say much. Don't hold your breath. Yeah, these bullet points on the right here were not really meant to be perfectly parallel with the functions on the left. I mean, the fact is, compartmentalization seems as a matter of practice to be important for life as we know it, as we say. I'm not sure how to give that an information theoretic interpretation, other than it makes it easier to locate the information somewhere, right? So, okay, but I don't know, I'm not yet able to envision a good equation to write down representing that concentration of information inside compartments. But that's what you would want. I just have no idea how to do it, so I didn't include it. I included adaptation because, of course, that becomes important. Once you have these things, once you get replication in particular, then you get not only mutual information between one generation and another, but by survival of the fittest kinds of things, you get more mutual information between the genome and the environment.
Thank you. I would like to ask about the result of obtaining this ether from the generalized entropy, and in particular on the role of the quantum corrections, because so as you said, with the area term, we have a thermodynamic interpretation of gravity and Carroll. Can you say something more about how the matter term contributes?
Yes. So in discussions of the generalized second law, which go back to Bekenstein and others, you see this equation over and over again. It's a little bit dissatisfying because it's trying to say that there is entropy in matter, but then there is a separate kind of entropy when, not in gravity, but specifically when you have a horizon, right? And that seems like, what if you came close to having a horizon but didn't? Like, shouldn't that have some impact on the formula, but it's nowhere there at all? So this is just what people use. And when they phenomenologically do it, as a matter of practice, they write S matter as an integral of an entropy density over space. And if you ask, where does that entropy density come from? Magic. It's, the number of photons per cubic centimeter, the number of particles per cubic centimeter. So I'm entirely in favor of trying to do better than this formula. It's pretty ad hoc on both terms.
Did you want to follow up? Can I just follow up quickly, Sean? I assume the S matter term there, if there's like thermal gravitons around, that will count as matter.
Yep.
There was someone over here, and then come over, George.
Thank you very much for the talk. I just wanted to ask a kind of more looking forward question of, in terms of trying to quantify those stages of complexity and how they develop with respect to time or with respect to entropy. All those graphs we had at the beginning looked relatively, qualitatively looked a bit like parabolas. Do you think that ultimately we can get a description of how complexity varies with time or with entropy that will work on all scales of complexity, from the micro-physical all the way up to the complexity of galaxies and things?
Sorry.
Yes. But I don't have, it's easy, it's an unfalsifiable statement. Because we could all be dead. I'm not going to tell you when we're going to have it. But I do think, it on the one hand, yes, there should be some robust formulation of exactly that kind of concept. On the other hand, as a practical matter, it might be very useful to have more specialized equations that work on different scales, just because the relevant time scales and interactions are very different.
No, that was just, I was going to ask him to
Elaborate on my answer.
Got it. Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, please join me in thanking Sean again.
Thank you very much.